What's going on, everybody? Jerry Handley here, Viking Performance Training, with my good friend JP, Jonathan Pishner of Apex Counseling, with today's new broadcast of Asymmetric Habits. Again, coming to podcast near you. And today's subject is one that we had brought up in our conversations a few months ago, actually, because I think you'll see that this is something that a lot of people go through, and with JP and counseling, myself and coaching are very common in our situations, but is figuring out how long you should deal with people who are just hard to work with, or figuring out when it's time to just cut it. And because just doing it immediately, if a situation doesn't seem like the right fit, may not even be an option, to tell you the truth. And long term, it may not necessarily even be the right choice. A lot of nuances go into this situation. So I know, JP, you can put this pretty well. So go ahead and let's get this rolling.
Well, I think you and me started talking about this with specific focus on athletes and coaches, and then we both kind of realized that it expanded out to work situations and a lot of other things. But the simple fact is that a lot of people stay in toxic environments longer than they should because, in spite of our deep love with the idea that we can be fully independent from our environment, the simple fact is it does impact us. And toxic environments impact us over the long term. And a lot of people will stay in them longer than they should. But the immediate reaction of, oh, this is not a great place to be, let me bounce out immediately, is also either not very reasonable or possible, or can be counterproductive in its own ways. So it's useful to talk about what are some of the signals that maybe this is not going to really pan out long term and I need to be looking for other options.
Right. And it's especially the very last word you said, options. Sometimes there may not seem like there are options, and sometimes there may not be an option, at least similar to what you are looking for, where a change would have to be kind of like a wholesale. So there's a lot of variation to the situation. I'll go right into one of the specific ones, that did kind of kick us off on this topic, for the listeners especially. But like dealing with athletes is coaches. They have their sports coach, and just about everybody who's been an athlete or just simply knows athletes, they know that they either know hard coaches or tales of how hard coaches can be, etc. A mark of a good coach, a lot of times though, is you'll see that regardless of what stories the athletes may tell about how hard their coach was, they'll also be able to tell about the respect, the overall care that the coach actually did have for the athletes or for you, whether it was just teaching how to do things the right way, embracing hard work, build like focusing on we, not I type of thing. Like there's a lot of different lessons that ideally come from a good coach to athlete relationship. But sometimes it just seems like that relationship is just just straight bad, straight toxic. The coach is, I don't want to just keep using that word, so I'm trying to come up with new words.
That's fine. It's the world you live in, man.
Yeah, but like I said, the coach just like whether it's just outright condescension, way too much, like yelling beyond a point of being useful, putting athletes down. Like I said, like there's just so many things that coaches can do bad, and in some situations they may honestly not necessarily have a good reason to do it, other than it's just how they like to do it. And again, like the more beat down, like the more I'm an authority figure, you just listen to me kind of style of coaching that is, like that may not fit with a lot of people. And again, if it's a particularly negative one, it might not be it might be a bad place overall for that athlete to be. But it's a really hard place in sports, because in sports and in school, because you don't these aren't places where you normally have a lot of choices. Now,
Yeah.
yeah, in some cases you may have a few, but in some cases it may not seem like you have any, especially if you want to go to the other side. If you're a high school athlete, you want to play college sports, and you just don't like your coach, you like strongly, that's still a hard spot because you don't necessarily have the option to just simply go to another school.
Yeah. Well, and it becomes difficult because in its way, we're talking about not only relationships, but careers, or we're talking about, life paths in certain respects.
Yes.
Uh, and that psychologically, that starts to become a heavy psychological load very quickly because you start accidentally getting too many variables involved, then your decision making starts to shut down because humans, in spite of the fact that we can invent cool stuff like airplanes and iPhones, are not nearly as psychologically flexible as we often like to believe we are. We still need a certain amount of limitation within our ability to think through things. And so, one of the ways that I like to start encouraging somebody to think through things, uh, even though it doesn't always necessarily solve things, it at least provides a good jumping off point and starts putting us in a useful direction, is just simple costs for things. So, like I can buy myself a reasonably decent T-shirt for $10. I have no interest in paying $150 for one. I don't care whose logo's on it. That's a cost I'm not willing to pay. And because most people, starting from the time they're about 14 or 15, have already started to come up with the idea of paying monetary costs for things.
Mm-hmm.
This is an easy heuristic for people to get into and just flex it a little bit to non-monetary. But a lot of times, what I'll start asking people is questions centered around, okay, you're in this situation. What are you getting out of this, or are going to eventually get out of it, or hope to eventually get out of it? And what is the present cost of this? So, let's take your athletic example, because I've worked with athletes a number of times. If we're going to say, okay, my high school football coach is a jerk, and I would really much prefer him to just get struck by lightning and never see him again. But I've got it in my head that I might actually have the talent and ability to play college ball, and I might be able to go pro. And okay, I've got one more year with this guy. Can I pay that cost in service of this thing that's a maybe, and a very slim maybe, but also a very powerful maybe? That at least starts putting us in a position of actual decision making. Because if you do have the talent and ability to play college and potentially pro ball, uh, then suddenly the benefits that can come might be worth the cost of one more year of putting up with this. They might not be. I'm not going to assume they are, but we at least now have a starting point for the conversation.
Yes. And and you pretty much summed up exactly some of the situations that I deal with a lot with athletes, especially the ones who want to go play somewhere else, because that coach is usually considered to be that's like a necessary cog. Because I mean, you can't like so, well, there are options now, but there aren't necessarily not everybody has them, and sometimes there just aren't options. Like one situation is like one facet to that I'd be curious to see what you have to say is let's say you have that 1 year example, this like senior athlete, one more season to go, they just really struggle seeing with this coach eye to eye, but they feel like they can play in college. Sometimes that coach is not only a necessary part of the team, sometimes they may be a necessary step. Like, because most college coaches are also going to go through a high school coach to find out about athletes. So not only do you have to say like decide to deal with the coach and accept the cost, there's also kind of a point where a degree of having to get the coach to I'm trying to struggle to how to say it, but I think you know what I'm trying to put down. Like where the coach needs to almost have a good opinion of you, or at least enough to where they will come to bat for you. Well, like when that time comes and another coach asks, or try to put your name out there, to try to put your name in other coaches' ears. Like the coach may have that type of importance to it. So it's not only can I handle this, but to a degree, it's also can I get them to help me? Can I do what I need to do so they will?
Yeah, well, and so this starts to become get where it becomes internally complicated, but the language of costs still applies fairly well here because uh, and everybody's going to experience the internal cost of this differently. Uh, I am very, very bad at trying to get the respect of somebody I don't respect or don't like. The internal cost for that is extraordinarily high for me. So happily, I'm not in this situation that we're making up. But if I was, the internal cost I would pay for having to essentially be nice to somebody's face when I really find them toxic and horrible is actually high enough that I would, no matter what the reward was, I would struggle with whether or not I should pay that. And I mean, if we're talking, I might have a $10 million pro ball contract. That might be just enough to put me over the edge, but for 2 mil, I mean, I don't know. The internal cost of that is like actually super high to me. And I
Mhm.
think one of the things that people lose track of, the reason this is so important, is because they will know that the internal cost is higher than they can really afford to pay, but the perceived practical benefits of either scholarships or if this is a work situation, your salary or your benefits, uh, because those seem high and because we have sort of a social approval of chasing those over the internal situation, a lot of people will way overextend and pay much more. I'm going to say a tragic level of cost uh, to achieve that when maybe they have no resources left. And that's where it becomes very difficult to parse through, and everybody becomes so individual because what one person can tolerate easily, another person can scarcely tolerate at all.
Great point. So these do seem to become more and more complicated. I feel like in pretty much almost, I think that's one of the things that makes this a struggle for so many people is how complicated it can get. Because like I said, even at the younger age where things might normally be simpler, this is a complicated process, and it's made even more complex by the systems and the rules that you kind of have to follow. Like we said, like with the coaches one, but then let's say you're an athlete, and you do have an option to go to another school system. Like if you're in a rural area and there's one school, you do not have that. But let's say you do have an option to go to another school system. That itself isn't necessarily easy either. There may be zoning rules about, you have to theoretically have residents in an area, or you have to go in front of a board and explain why you're choosing, like why you want to go to another area. And then it's usually their choice whether or not to let you, play immediately, or you have to sit out a year. There's a lot of red tape and just different steps to go through with that. So I really like your method of pointing out the cost, and then also how it's different for people. Because this to me is one of those places like you definitely want to, just gather as much useful information as possible, and really think of it like to me it's like if you're getting close to where you think there may have to be a decision, there almost needs to be a weighing of pros and cons to go into that, deciding what the value is. And I mean, part of that is going to be just literally finding out what all the steps are, and adding that to it, because it's like, okay, like not just emotionally, psychologically going to go like going through this, but then all the steps involved. Because I know some athletes who have done this and been allowed to transfer and play with the other school with what seemed like relatively no issue. I also know some who've taken 6, 8 months, numerous appeals, and still not gotten the decision that they wanted. So I mean, it goes
Yeah.
both ways. So there's a lot, and it's not, unfortunately, not a usually a quick fix, make a decision and go to it. There's a lot of
Mhm.
steps in that.
Well, and since you're already talking about decision making, there's a good thing to, and I think you'll appreciate this, given the way your mind works, because one of the things that a lot of people get so caught up in is trying to make a perfect decision. And when you're trying to exit a toxic work or hobby or athletic environment and trying to figure out what you should do, a lot of people get caught up in trying to really perfect that too. Like they don't want to change jobs until they have something absolutely perfect lined up. And the reason that creates some difficulty is that there's an awful lot of our decisions and awful lot of our circumstances that have way more to do with luck than we would prefer to admit. Um, Heck, I mean, one person gets a scholarship and one doesn't. How much does that have to do with like the scout had to run to the bathroom at the inopportune time and they missed like the most killer play that person made the entire game?
It's crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, there's simply no accounting for certain things. So what I usually encourage people to think about is a little more of a mathematical way, which is not this one decision, but if you had to make this same decision 1,000 times, would it work out in the majority of the cases? And you know, the way I learned to think about this was when I was learning to play poker, which is probably not the most greatest of place for life lessons, but in this case, it works. Uh, there are certain hands when you're playing Texas Hold'em, for anybody who plays that game, that you bet heavy no matter what, because over 1,000 permutations, that is the right move. If you come up with pocket aces, you're betting heavy no matter what. It doesn't matter what else is on the table. It doesn't matter what you think the other people have. 99 times out of 100, you're betting heavy because over enough permutations of that hand, you win. What most people do that is the mistake is that they try and come up with a perfect decision instead of saying, okay, if I made the same decision a bunch of times in a row, how many times would it pan out? And there's times when it's 80, 85, 90, 95% of the time this would work, but they get paralyzed because they can't figure out how to absolutely perfect that decision. Give you a great example. I have never yet talked to there might be outliers, but people who work as lawyers for some of the bigger agencies. I don't know if you've ever heard some of these stories, but the billable hours they make these lawyers do is completely insane. Uh, I have never yet heard the story of where somebody went from one of those places, opened up their own practice, and was miserable.
Mm.
Like, I'm kind of running through my Rolodex of faces, and out of at least 10, 12, 15 people, the results have been overwhelmingly, this has been so much better. But how many people sit on their hands and don't do such a thing because they're worried they're going to be that 1% case that like it doesn't work, something's horrible. And that's a good example of like, wow, if you did this 100 times, 99 times it would work, or 95 or 90, and
Yeah.
that would be a great bet.
I mean, I feel like you're laying down something that could actually be an entire another topic, because like we have such tendencies to fixate on that what if, no matter how small of a likelihood that what if actually is. We have such a tendency to make our decisions or not make decisions based on that. It's funny because growing up, I used to think of that as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark taking that step when he can't see a walkway. And towards the end, then he just finds the invisible concrete, basically.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Like I used to think of that. That image would come to mind a lot. Like you just got to take that step and go for it.
Not to be with that guy, but wasn't that Last Crusade?
Oh yeah, sorry, Last Crusade, the third one. Yeah. Yep.
-3 nerd points. All right.
Sorry. Well, I'm about to make it back up. I hope, because in the last 2 weeks, I've made like an analogy that I have used at least 3 times. Is like Doctor Strange in the Avengers when he comes up with it. Like I've seen all the different ways that this could work out, and this is how many ways actually work. Like I've brought that up at least 3 times in the last 2 weeks. So when you were talking about all the different ways that it could work out, how often does it work out well? I was instantly thinking of Doctor Strange. But yeah, like that is, and especially because there's that mixture of statistics are there, especially in cases like this, to help you ideally make those decisions overall. based on trends, but people can't let go of that. I am one, and yeah, like if it happens to be a bad one, then I made the bad decision, and there we go.
Mhm.
And that's something. I mean, again, that happens all the time in life. That's something that we ideally, hopefully, learn at some point. That's just kind of part of the game and learn from it. But it doesn't make it any less hard when you come up with it, whether you're a teenager or, like you said, whether you're just like at an unhappy workplace. Like it can be so
Mhm.
much harder to do with that. And I feel like I'm curious about this part because I know we talk about relationships and the stories of people around you a lot. Is I also feel like most of the time when people go through this, they're generally surrounded by a lot of people who try to talk them out of making the change or looking to make a change. Like if it is the athlete, you're gonna usually have most people around you, teammates, friends, maybe likely even family telling you like this is just the way it is. Some coaches are just hard. You just have to kind of like deal with it. But again, it can be that way in work too, like coworkers, just family members again who in different jobs, it's just like, oh, like we all have bosses we don't like or blah blah blah, like that's just the way it is. Whereas it's in the minority, the people, I feel like the people who actually would tell you to go ahead and look at other options or try it are usually in the minority of voices you hear.
Yeah, and I always like I'm trying not to go on a rant because like that phrase, "This is just the way it is," always wants to make me like really start speaking so rapidly you can't even understand me. Um, yes, oftentimes it is the way it is. That doesn't mean participation is a good idea. Give you a great example. Matter of fact, here's a business idea for anybody that wants it, free. You don't even have to, pay me or anything. But if you drop me a check, fine. As soon as somewhere in this country opens up a medical school that is not an absolute psychological meat grinder, that doesn't teach people to not take care of themselves and stay up till 4 a.m. cramming for stuff, it will destroy every other medical school in the entire country as soon as one person opens that up and gets it going. Because as soon as like somewhere breaks out of it a little bit, everybody's going to want that. They're not going to want to participate in the thing that, oh, that's just the way it is anymore. That's why you have some employers who absolutely have their pick of everybody. Like look at Dan Price or Gary Vaynerchuk. I mean, one job opens up at their places and they have 70,000 applicants probably. I mean, I'm just guessing. I didn't actually read that, but I mean, it becomes ridiculous. People are starting to figure out that you don't have to participate in broken systems. And the more people realize that, the more you'll see some of these broken systems go away. So my encouragement to everybody is, if there is any way at all to not participate in a broken system, then get out. Stop participating. And as a matter of fact, you're having that right now. There's so many companies whining about quiet quitting. Like, what they are whining about is the fact that a lot of people suddenly realized that there's better options than having to do a whole bunch of unpaid extra work. And now everybody suddenly stopped. And now the job market is going to simply have to adjust. The more people start boycotting crap employers or crap coaches or terrible managers, the more suddenly these people are going to have enough problems that they either have to shift and adjust or they're going to just get kicked out of the market. But granted, that's long term. Like we're usually talking about short term solutions. That's a long term solution, and I got on a rant there anyway, even though I was trying not to.
Right. We
But
could honestly end the podcast on that. It's like I feel like because I had to write that one down, not even as a thought, but as like that was gold. People are starting to figure out they don't have to participate in broken systems. Like that's it.
yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
like,
and I mean, you and I have the same thing. Granted, we're small businesses; we're not great big corporations, but like, uh, how easy is it for us to get and maintain good people? Because we're so much better and easier to work for than like half the places that are just meat grinders.
I actually just telling somebody yesterday, or no, this morning, like just a couple of hours ago on a Zoom call, how a lot of the rules that most gyms have that don't actually mean anything, we just don't have them. It's like there's no reason to have these rules, so we just don't have them. We're not going to have rules just for the sake of it.
Yeah, yeah. I learned not so long ago that apparently you're not allowed to wear jeans at my gym for some reason because that
Things like
matters
that.
apparently.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, like no one under 16 really. I mean, if that's who you're catering to, that's fine. But stuff like that, or um, but yeah, like there's so many instances of that. But the broken system is good. And actually, I do want to talk about that long term fix a little bit because that is something that can still be started on the short term. That I feel like people do need to realize. Like so many people who do go through these situations miss their opportunity. Like they either miss or they flat out decide against taking their opportunity to at least make their situation be heard, and that could potentially start some momentum into actually fixing it. Because you also never know in some of these situations, like as big as different groups might be, there may still be, just one or two people kind of who like the whole thing comes down to. And if those one or two people get a wind of something they don't like, then I mean that could change the game. Like people forget about that a lot of times though. When things get really big, say a corporation or say an entire school board, a lot of times the people at the top do not know, everything that's happening below them because they're actually doing their job well in a sense of not micromanaging everything. But that also
Right.
means they don't necessarily know everything that's happening. So when there is a situation, it can be worth going to them. Like with athletes, for example, a lot of times a like one reason I think changes to some of these systems in schools can be hard is the people suffering through it, the athletes and their families graduate out, they age out, and they move out. Whereas the people who may be doing like if the people who are not in the right fit for the school system, but they're in there, they might be there for decades or at least years. So like as the people who go through it, so good for the people who get out and they like lasted or whatever, made that call. But it means that cycle just continues to stay there and works around until something finally changes to bring the attention to a higher up. And I've actually heard of that happening multiple times around here in the last few years. Is like people starting to get together a little bit and changing some of these things with coaches who might have like just less than stellar reputations with their athletes and their families. So it's just using, so in that situation, it would be like just actually bringing it up to boards or groups that matter.
Mhm.
But, like in a respectful, ideally organized manner, like it's not just go in and complain, but you got to have actual reasons. But workplace as well is, I feel like the statistic, I do not have a statistic on it, but I feel like exit interviews could be one of those useful ones that do not get used as often. A lot of like we are talking about either quiet quitting or whatever. When people leave jobs, if they have an opportunity for an exit interview, or they even if they were to ask for one, or I said they could, a lot of people don't take them because they simply think, okay, like I'm leaving, this is my chance to get out. I don't want to do one more thing like this for this. But it actually could be that opportunity to at least move things forward in that company culture if they're actually taking those interviews seriously.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was going to say because I think there's a lot of people based on what some of my clients have often told me who view the potential cost of being honest in that way in an exit interview as being too high because if you need a letter of reference from a job or if you need something from them in the future, uh you know depending on who is seeing the exit interview and depending on who and how that impacts, then they're perceiving often, I think, that the cost is potentially dangerous. So I think in a lot of ways people are actually accepting my advice if they're cautious during an exit interview because they don't know what the potential cost might be. Especially if they should ever need to come back here for another job, like maybe their thing falls through, they at least want to have that to go back to, even if it's presently miserable. So it becomes tricky when you talk about like how do we make long-term change, for people's situations in this way, because I think my if I was to give a general idea, it would be people who are more comfortable paying those costs. The people who are less comfortable should leave it to them. So, like for example, I know I brought this up a time or two on the podcast, and granted, the cost was not going to be great to you no matter what. But I love that thing where Amazon kept screwing up the book order, and you literally just went on the internet and started like bitching at Amazon, just out to the universe. Now, granted, that was not going to really give you any cost whatsoever. But if the circumstances had been different, if we were talking about an employer or something, there could have been high cost to that. Some people can stomach that kind of situation, that exposure, and the anxiety that comes with it, and the uncertainty of what might happen. And then there's a lot of people who cannot stomach that, especially in employer situations, because we're talking about literally where your money comes from. And if they easily make up that, like, oh, if a future employer finds out that I like did some kind of whistleblowing of any nature, are they going to want to hire me? And they're really going to perceive that cost as potentially great. Uh, so I think my answer would be, for the people who are scared to pay that cost, don't worry about paying the cost, and maybe leave it to the people who are a little more comfortable paying that cost, instead of like, because we're literally telling we're literally talking about getting out of one toxic situation, but then you can accidentally create your own new internal toxic situation by whistleblowing if like you're not psychologically prepared for that.
JP, you are full of some insightful shit. You know that?
I appreciate you
I
saying
would
that.
not have thought about that at all, but that was a great point, and it made complete sense. And especially too, like that's one of those things that like that right there is something that people need to learn, because I know that if you are not always, but if you are the type of person who can stomach that, it can be hard to think at first why other people wouldn't. But like I said, what you said makes complete sense, especially like with that, like, oh man, like, yeah, like the different responses, but it can seem like a black and white, like, man, like, why aren't you doing this? But
Why don't you tell somebody? Tell people.
Yep. So I have a couple like these specific situations I wanted to run by you, and get like the advice you have. So we'll use like no specific orders, since we just happen to be talking about like exit interviews and that. We'll use professional first. So if someone professionally is in a situation where, again, they're just not jiving with the workplace, whether it's like a manager or just the people around them, whatever, something like that. But situation is, they're in charge of their income, they're in charge of the household. Like not having money would be a very bad thing for this person right now. um, how would you kind of help this person kind of get things in order so they can start moving towards trying to find an improvement? What would be like the order of steps you'd like this person to do?
So step one is math. 100% math, nothing else. How much do you need to sustain everything? And when I say sustain, like also thinking of, can you step down your standard of living temporarily to get out of a toxic situation? Because that can be very important. But what a lot of people will do is they will completely skip this step. And certainly not everybody, but a small subsection of people find out that they need way less money than they originally thought to maintain everything, and have way more flexibility to pursue more aggressive changes. So that's number one. Number two, even if you're not in that lucky subsection of people, once you do the math and you have actual numbers instead of scary, crazy what ifs, that's actually easier for the brain to deal with, because human beings are not well programmed to deal with the unknown. I mean, that's why the edges of the map always said, "Here there be dragons," because the unknown is scary. But if we at least move it from unknown to known, even if the known is not particularly good for the brain, that's a psychologically more easy place to deal with. And then you can figure out options. Like, okay, I know I need $10,000 a month to sustain everything, and I know, let's say doctor. I know my job as a doctor at the hospital is just killing me, and I'm going to die in a year if I don't get this. So I got to figure out, okay, what if I did 20 hours of Ubering plus this other 40-hour job? Can I bring up to 10,000? And you start actually moving into a problem solving place. And that step might take a significant amount of time, energy, and effort. What a lot of people will mess up on is they will do it for 10 minutes and give it up as a bad job. This is a thing that if you know you're in a toxic environment, then you really should be spending a ton of your energy on exiting the toxic environment, unless you can find some way to tolerate it. But I will tell you, well, I've told you this directly, but for the people listening to this that haven't heard it, the number one trauma I treat is not what you would think.
Yep.
The number one trauma I treat is wear and tear trauma from bad job fit that went on too long. I treat that more often than I treat childhood sexual abuse. I treat that more often than car crashes. I treat that more often than pretty well anything. So if you want to know how damaging this is, as a trauma therapist, that's the trauma I treat most often.
Yeah. That is okay. So that is a real life equivalent of the top guest on Family Feud that nobody figures out.
Yes.
That's what it is. It's like number one and nobody gets it. It's like, oh, like no.
Like I could give somebody 50 guesses and they would never come up with that. And until I sat down and I was like, oh my God, I see X number of bad job fits a year and X number. I was like, oh my God, this is what I treat the most. So that would be step one is if you know you're in a bad, and this is a job related situation and you're the provider and you're locked into being the provider, you got to sit down and start doing the math, because your environment over the course of time can absolutely kill you. It'll take a long time, thank God, but like your environment can do enough physical damage to eventually shorten your lifespan.
Yeah. So what about just simply then at that point, what's to kind of at least have a number, just something to make someone feel like they're progressing towards what they need after that?
That's the hard part, because especially that first step, that is such a slog. If you have the flexibility to do this, I would do it this way. I would hire outside eyes. I would hire a therapist. I would hire a coach. I would hire somebody, because they can externally help you track your progress. Because the felt sense of progress in this kind of thing, it's very hard to feel like you're getting anywhere. Whereas somebody with outside eyes has a tendency to be able to say, no, look, you generated two almost viable options. They're not quite viable, but that means we might be close to a viable option here. No, you're doing great. Stay the course. Hearing that from an outside observer is often a good way to know that you're doing kind of okay. Now, not everybody has the flexibility or money to be able to like do that. And if you do not, one of the best things you can do is kind of start the very day you start, the day you decide you gotta make a change, is start recording the things that you are actually doing to make the change. Because at least then you have a written record of, oh no, that's right, I worked for 4 hours the other night on this. I am doing something, I'm just not yet generating very much. And in a way, it's kind of like the gym. You know, some people get massive gains that first little bit, and some people work 6, 8, 12, 16, 20 weeks, and really not much happens. And then somewhere they hit that critical mass and things jump. But, it's hard to feel like you're getting very far until you reach that critical mass and start seeing actual practical results.
All right, good stuff. And flip side situation, again, just advice here. The person who is in one of these situations that it's somebody they just feel they cannot work with, but the rare situation where they truly basically have to, quote unquote. So it's most direct, most direct and maybe most common one that I can think of, or at least very common, is a student in public school and just with a teacher that they just have that they clash with. And because it's pretty rare that you can just flat out change a teacher. It might be a necessary course to actually graduate to the next level. Now, these days there are more options than there were even 5 years ago. Like there might be online versions, like as school choice picks up and there's more charter schools, etc. So I mean, options are growing, but that's still a pretty classic example that a lot of people with kids will either be familiar with or have gone through themselves. Because again, just that teacher that you feel is you just have a terrible relationship with, but they're literally there until you can pass.
All right. So, parents, give me a minute to defend my answer before you burn me at the stake. Because this makes sense as long as you listen to the whole thing. I still encourage people, including children, not to believe in have to. The reason I encourage this is because have to encourages a mindset of powerlessness, which is the most psychologically destructive mindset you can have. You don't have to continue to tolerate this. The reason you do is because you make the choice that tolerating it is actually still the best option. Like, for example, and this does happen to a very small subset of children who I would not encourage to do this, but they exist. They hate school or their teachers so much that they create enough problems to get expelled. They made a choice. Most kids, happily, will make the choice of, oh, no, getting expelled is way too costly on my home life. It's way too costly on my relationship with my parents. Granted, they're not using these words in their head, but they have an innate sense of this. It's too much cost socially. So, yes, I am choosing to stay here and put up with this teacher I don't like, but I'm doing it because I want to be able to keep being friends with Billy, Molly, and Sally, and because I like playing on my football team, and because I like not having stress at home with my parents, and putting it in the mindset of not have to, but I choose to because, which,
And then kind of
for
on all the good things they get from it.
right. And that's a mindset of empowerment. So the behavior stays exactly the same, but the mindset is different. Like I choose to stay in this because it makes the most sense for these reasons.
I like that. That's good. That's really good. So I said, and I think those hit a couple of the situations that most people will come to.
Yeah.
So,
However, back to the thesis is if you know that the situation is toxic and untenable, finding a way to exit is absolutely the right thing as quickly as humanly possible because toxic environments are destructive to your psychology and to your biology.
yeah. And actually, that made me think like too. Like this is another one of those things where, like I mentioned it before about in the relationship with kids aging out, they could actually age back into a situation too in some cases. So, like something I've seen, like just with these last few years and with the lockdowns and the pandemic and et cetera, is there were a good number of kids who just when schools opened back up or whatever, they were not it just wasn't being a good fit for them. They just like didn't like it. They were lashing out in some way. Something was happening that once they got back to school that they didn't like, and it was whether acting out, causing problems, whatever it might be. Taking time to leave that system, like I said, whether it was it homeschool for a year or two, maybe go online for a year or two, whatever it might be, and then maybe like that might help them get like love for school back or appreciation, want to go to school again, and letting time kind of heal that process a little bit, and then seeing if they want to go back. And that's something that I actually have started to see a little bit is people who like just didn't handle maybe part of the lockdown well, or they didn't handle going back well. They left it for a year or two, but now they're actually either have gone back or are ready to go back because they seem to have like regained like wanting to go to school or a love for learning. Like, it can come from all sorts of different angles.
Yeah, so let's turn that into something more generally usable, because
Yeah.
certainly not everybody will be able to deploy that solution, but there is a nugget of something quite usable in there. Basically, you can extend your ability to be in stressful situations or toxic situations by taking time away to let that heal. That is absolutely a thing that works reasonably well for a lot of situations. Not everyone, but for a lot of them. The trick is sometimes you have to get really creative about how to do that. So let's take a very common one that a lot of people are utilizing with their children right now. A lot of people are allowing their children to stay home for mental health days. Especially in situations where bullying is occurring and those kinds of things. Um, that's a terrifically difficult situation to solve. And one of the things you can do to extend somebody's ability to be okay is to give them time away from that system just to like recover their psychological resources. So even if you can't take a whole year off by swapping schools or going to homeschool, if we're talking about the student athlete situation, certainly most jobs, you can't just bounce out for a year and then come back. But finding ways to cycle out of the toxic situation temporarily, even if it's just burning up vacation time.
Yep.
That's one way to do it, a very common way to do it. Some people are lucky enough that their jobs will allow them to do like a, hey, work 6 months for this other department type of situation. There are many jobs that allow that kind of thing to happen. If you can find ways to rotate out of the toxic situation, grab them, because that extends the lifespan for how long you can stay in a toxic situation before you absolutely have to leave.
One place that I think um like the business or the just employment situation is improving is I do think there are just more places in general are they're giving more options of freedom in a sense. Like, yeah, whether it is like mental health days or just simply more control of vacation days, things of that nature.
What
Um,
work from home, 4-day work weeks, like we are actually seeing possibly the edges of a renaissance in our relationship with work, which is very exciting.
yeah,
Uh,
like results based work rather than time based work. Like,
mhm.
like they, and I've had that conversation with people close to me, even, yeah, as like, with trying to choose one job or the other. And it's like, if the numbers might be better in one, but if it cuts down on that freedom and that freedom's like important to you about when to work, when you can take time off, just like you said, like there's a value cost in that for sure. And I was just talking to somebody a few days ago. I can't remember who it was, but they told me that a big part of their strategy with their business is they take a week off every quarter. This was somebody who runs a business, but big part. But they also mentioned how they encourage their employees to try to figure out ways to do the same thing. And they're like, yeah, like things can get crazy, the stress can build up, but taking a week like every 3 months seems to really work for them. So yeah, finding
I,
those
I,
strategies.
I found the similar thing last year. I haven't gotten good at implementing it yet. I'm getting better, but I did discover that if I if I deploy something extremely similar to that, it really does boost my productivity immensely. Although it's not like it's not like I'm in a toxic situation in the first place, but it still helps get away from the stress and rebuild those psychological resources.
That boss of yours. So, all right, brother. I mean, great talk. Great talk. I feel like this is really a good one. You want to hit some bullet points?
Yeah. So if we recap, basically, you can be in a toxic environment, or excuse me, I should say an environment that's toxic for you, because what's toxic to one is not necessarily toxic to another. But you can make that work for a while. But if you start seeing that it's untenable, figuring out an exit is probably going to be essential. Unless you can somehow psychologically justify how the benefits are going to be more important than the stress you're under right now. If we talk about athletes, great big pro contracts or some other, real reward. Then figuring out like if you absolutely have to exit, what needs to happen for you to do that? For the employed person, it's usually you have to stop and do the math. For the athlete or other type of situation, it's usually figuring out what opportunities are you costing yourself, and are you okay with the cost? 99% of the time, the answer is yes, because frankly, toxic environments are way worse than opportunity cost most of the time. And then for the people who are kind of stuck, still working on the way out, even if it's going to take a long time, is a more empowered position than just remaining stuck and being like, well, whoopsie daisy, I guess my life sucks and there's nothing I can do about it. The behavior remains the same, but operating from a place of choices is always better.
Awesome. Great stuff, brother. All right. Thank you those for listening. Again, feel free to share, comment, anything like that. Reach out to either one of us if you have questions, of course, with anything. Meanwhile, we're looking forward to our next talk here in a couple of weeks, and we'll catch everybody later. Hope you have a great week.
See y'all soon.